Okay, good morning, everybody. My name is Chris Daniel. I'm with the Center for the Study of Commercial Activity at Ryerson University in Toronto, and I'm going to be talking to you today about some of the changes that are happening in the retail infrastructure in the city of Toronto, and how that's affecting some of the commercial strips that we track at the CSEA. So, just to give you a brief outline of what I'm going to talk about. I'll describe some of the growth management policies that are happening in the Toronto region, and then kind of place those policies within some of the waves of retail development and consumer change that's been taking place in Toronto over the decades. Then I'll describe mixed use, new urbanism, and complete communities, because that's really basically that's the current wave of development that's happening in Toronto. And one of the problems with that is that we don't really have very good metrics to measure how that change is happening. We don't have very good metrics to help us decide how to implement those mixed use and new urbanism kind of communities. So part of my PhD research, there's two main sort of metrics that I'm working on. The first one is to come up with some typologies of mixed use, because we don't really know exactly how to describe what mixed use is in any kind of detail. Secondly, I'm looking at some methodologies to measure the impact of virtual retail on physical space needs and commercial mix. How do we estimate how much retail do we actually need in these mixed-use communities? And then at the end, I'll talk about, I'll describe a little bit about what those metrics mean essentially for the future of commercial strips. So growth management in the Toronto area goes back, essentially my PhD research, the impetus for it goes back to 2006, where the province of Ontario implemented what's called the Places to Grow Act, which gives the province the authority to override municipal development plans, and basically they can tell cities and municipalities how they're going to grow. And so the policy that the plan that they came up for, the Greater Golden Horseshoe Growth Plan, essentially it works in tandem with also the Greenbelt Act. So you guys might be familiar with the Greenbelt in Portland, right? So it's the same kind of idea. They have this greenbelt that goes around the outside of the city. It's one of the largest greenbelts in the world. And so what that says is no new suburban development is allowed to take place in that greenbelt. And instead, all the population growth is meant to be handled by the existing city infrastructure, specifically through these 25 urban growth centers. So that's these little yellow dots. And so essentially in those 25 urban growth centers, the population growth, which Toronto is experiencing very rapid population growth, is meant to be handled through these mixed-use developments, which are encouraged to be ultra-high density. And one of the problems with this policy is that there's very little actual policy guidance into what mixed-use actually means. It tends to be treated more as something where people know it when they see it, right? But there's very little actual solid metrics on what that is. So before I go into those details, let's just think a little bit about some of the waves of retail development that's been happening in the city of Toronto, so that we can situate the current wave of development within that. So pre-1940s, we had essentially we have the age of the department store. So palaces of consumption. In terms of the consumer habits, we've got very low consumer mobility, with basically transportation is based on a combination of streetcars, automobiles, and very high walkability. Beginning in the 1950s and then through the 60s and 70s is when you started to see planned shopping centers being developed in the city of Toronto. So the automobile obviously changed the way consumers shop quite dramatically. And so likewise, that changes the retail structure. Now, beginning in the late 80s and into the 90s, that's the era of the power center. So power centers really took off through the 90s, and that's been the major kind of debate in this area. as to what is the impact, should we be doing this. Power centers basically leveled off. Power center development leveled off in the 2000s, and we really haven't seen much power center development since then. Starting in 2010, that's kind of when these policies of smart growth essentially started to have an impact on the development pipeline. So that's where we start to see blurring of retail formats and location types. So formerly we had all these big box kind of locations in power centers. So those are actually getting smaller in Canada. And we start to see more things like more urban concepts, mixed use, multi-use, hybrid power, and mall retail, kind of incorporating those things into existing infrastructure. So, this current wave it's very blurred, right? And in fact, I'd say the whole retail environment seems to be getting very blurred as well. We have grocery stores selling fresh fruit. We have general merchandisers selling prescription drugs and food as well. The lines of everything, not just store types are getting blurred, but also the actual developments themselves. Everything's getting mixed. So when we talk about mixed use, like I said, it's something you know it when you see it. So the problem with that is that people have different definitions as to what mixed use is. Mixed use can be entire neighborhoods. Mixed use can also happen within individual buildings, right? So you get a combination of uses. Retail on the main floor, usually in current developments, it tends to be condominiums on top. So these things can happen in isolation, out in more suburban areas, but they can also happen together in these new sort of planned communities. So the planned communities of Toronto at the moment are these mixed-use kind of environments. Now, mixed use and these smart growth kind of policies are not restricted to the City of Toronto. Here's an example of a shopping mall, Lansdowne Centre in Richmond, BC. It's a suburb of Vancouver. So we've all seen this mall before. This is Lansdowne Centre, but I'm sure it's very familiar to many other malls you've seen over the course of your lives. They've got an island of retail in the middle of a sea of parking. They've been having some growth in vacancy rates over the years, and consequently the developers have decided to redevelop the entire site. So what they're doing with this location, the whole thing's going to be basically plowed under, and they're going to put in this mixed-use, new urbanist, complete community where we're all going to come back to life in watercolor, and life is going to be great, where we can live, work, and play all in the same environment. So obviously, major changes happening here, right? But we don't have good metrics to measure how exactly the retail in this kind of development should be done. First of all, we don't really have a good understanding of what the types of mixed use are. We also don't have a good idea as to estimate how much retail space do we actually need in these places, right? Because you want to get the right mix. You don't want to build too much retail because then you have vacancy blight, but at the same time you don't want to have too little retail either, because then you're not meeting the needs of the people who live in these communities. So the first part of my PhD research, which I've presented elsewhere and I won't spend as much time on it today, is to come up with a typology of mixed use. So for this research, I got some property assessment data and was able to use cluster analysis to come up with a 4-cluster solution, basically identifying 4 main types of mixed use. The first one being regional shopping centers, where they have they've incorporated condominiums or office towers somewhere on the pad. The second type is primarily office-based, and you find that mostly in older downtowns of the larger municipalities. So primarily office-based with retail on the main floor. And then the last two, we have community and traditional mixed use, where they're very similar. The traditional mixed use tends to have a bit more of a retail focus, whereas the community mixed use it tends to be a bit newer, and it focuses more on services as opposed to retail. Now, the main thing I'm going to talk about today is coming up with some methodologies and some metrics as to how can we estimate the amount of resale space that actually needs to be implemented in some of these locations. Now, it's a really difficult thing to do, and there's plenty of municipal planning boards where there's all kinds of arguments about the people who want to develop, they want more retail space. People with competing shopping centers nearby, they say there should be less, and so there's a lot of argument about exactly how you should do this. But essentially, one of the main things that has to be considered here, considering the retail environment today, is that you have to take into account the impact of e-commerce on estimating commercial space needs. So we heard a lot yesterday about the coming retail apocalypse, right? Basically saying, and all the media, the newspapers are telling us that there's going to be a corresponding decline in retail with the growth of e-commerce. But how much will e-commerce sales actually grow in each category? That's a really difficult thing to measure and to estimate, because especially, I'm not sure exactly what it's like in the United States, but in Canada, the e-commerce data that our National Statistics Agency collects is not very good. Some people think it's good, but people who work in retail know that essentially the way it works is that the companies who operate in Canada, the retail companies who operate in Canada, they self-report to our National Statistics Agency what their online sales are versus traditional bricks and mortar sales. So those are the numbers that Statistics Canada reports. However, there's everybody in reality. We don't just order things online from Canadian retailers, and in fact, plenty of times things are being shipped from China or across the border from the United States, and that makes up a huge portion of e-commerce sales. So just using the national statistics on e-commerce is not a reliable measure. But even once you do have a good handle on where e-commerce sales are at today and estimates for the future, what will that impact of e-commerce sales growth be on things like square footage per capita and the number of stores per capita? There's lots of people who say that that there won't be a corresponding decline in square footage, because people will still use retail stores for basically as showrooms, where they'll go and look at products and then buy it online. Likewise, with the number of stores, there's a lot of discussion with the idea that that retail stores, as a result of e-commerce and showrooming, that stores will get smaller, and there will be more of them, right? Because they're smaller, they can be more convenient. So how do we get a handle on these ideas? For my research, I decided to do a Delphi expert survey. So I took a group of experts in the Toronto area. So that's people from urban planning. We've got people working in retail, consultants. So I asked them all a series of questions. And I won't spend too much time talking about the details of this, but essentially, I asked them 3 questions. One about e-commerce, to estimate where it's at today and where they think it would be in the future. So I asked them specifically, integrated golden horseshoe, what percentage of purchases do you estimate would be ordered online in the following retail store types by 2021, 2031, and 2041? Now, of course, many people were uncomfortable with estimating that far into the future, but this is the planning horizon that these kind of projects take on. So this is what we have to work with. Secondly, I said, given your estimates on the future of e-commerce sales, what do you estimate will be the effect on square feet per capita for those same set of retail store types? Then I also asked them to estimate, given what they said about e-commerce, given what they said about the effect on square footage, what do you think will be the corresponding change in the number of stores per capita for those same set of retail store types? So I asked them to fill that out for each of the 3-digit NAICS categories. So looking at, so let's look at what the results of that actually were. So there was, in pretty much all the categories, all of those categories are projected to have increases, with electronics leading the way, followed by fashion and sports and hobby. Hardware and furniture were further down on that list. So e-commerce is projected to grow significantly in Canada over the next 20 years. What did they think that actually meant for square footage per capita? How will square footage change? You can see the course there is an estimation of decline in pretty much all of the categories except for food services, but it's not the same trajectory or negative trajectory that you see from e-commerce. In terms of number of stores, pretty much the results is flat. The number of stores will stay the same, but with square footage estimates saying that most people think that stores will get smaller. So what does that mean for the future of our commercial strips? So I decided to focus on kind of a case study, looking essentially at Yonge Street. That's the main street in Toronto. It's one of the longest retail strips in Canada. With the Places to Grow Act coming in 2006, a lot of the height restrictions that were previously in place to maintain a more traditional character of that retail strip were taken out, and so significant changes have taken place. Primarily, the further away you get from the core, the more opportunity there was to actually build new high-rise development, with downtown already having a significant amount of that. So this segment up here of Yonge Street, segment 1, saw some significant changes through high-density development. So this is just a street view, basically from the south end of segment 1, looking north. You can see here there's a development that went in. I think it was like 90. It's a 90-story condominium tower, so incredibly high density, with 3 levels of retail on the main floor. And then up at the north end of that, we've got, so this strip has basically been bookended by 2 of those developments. We have a development here where they put in an Apple store and a Nordstrom rack, and you can see that other building in the background there. So the idea being, put in this high intensity development on either ends, and then you can see there's development taking place along there. So there's 4 or 5 other developments that are happening, and more coming in the future. So CSCA tracks, we go out and we actually field survey all the retail strips in the city of Toronto. So we actually have yearly data on what retail looks like on Yonge Street. So the graph you're looking at here shows, on one side we've got 2007. So here we're looking at total square footage devoted to different types of retail. And then along 2017 on the bottom. So this actually, Yonge Street, this part of Yonge Street was one of the first places in Canada to really see the development taking place as a result of smart growth policies. So it's kind of like I think that it's like a precursor. It was developed in advance and basically provides some evidence of some of the trends that people were estimating. So you can see here, so food services and drinking places. In 2007, that was just over 20%, right? But in 2017, we're up at 28%. So there's been a huge increase in the character of the retail in this strip as these developments have taken place. Traditional, more retail categories like clothing and accessories, miscellaneous, sporting goods and hobby, all of those things have seen declines in their share of the retail environment. So that's looking just at square footage. If we look at it in terms of number of establishments, food services and drinking places, again, that's gone, so that's an even greater increase. So from 25% up to almost 35%, and the similar declines in those other main categories. So to kind of sum it all up, essentially, the future of retail strips, I think, says that there will be less space for actual retail. So we used to call these retail strips. That was how we labeled that category of our research. we don't call them retail strips anymore. We call them commercial strips because retail is taking up less and less and less of the pie of storefronts. So there's going to be a transition of space from retail to service. There will also be some growing impact of e-commerce through physical to virtual, but there will also be some e-commerce retailers will be opening up storefronts as well. There'll be a decline overall of transactional retail, which is like actually going in to find something you want and buying it. So there'll be also a decline in discretionary spending in the retail types. But with the increase in population in those high density towers, we'll see convenience and necessity increasing. There'll also be an increase of experiential retail. Primarily in services, we'll have increased food and personal health, and we'll probably see an increase too in things like other kinds of businesses like real estate agents and things like that. So retail as a result of these small growth policies, it's taking on more of a street activation and animation, and that's kind of what we need to understand. But we also need some of these kinds of metrics to help us analyze and understand it quantitatively, not just in watercolor. Thanks.